of Kurt Vonnegut Jr. I had found a copy of a novel he'd published a couple of years earlier called Cat's Cradle, and had given it a fast read. It was compelling, but it was very far removed from the books and stories I'd been studying the past year. Henry James he was not. So it was with considerable apprehension that I trudged across Madison Street for my half-time job at the University of Iowa's Public Relations Office. To the Quonsets, the workshop Quonsets, these were leftover World War II Quonsets, for the first meeting with our new writing coach. Right now, those Quonsets are gone, and replacing them is the laser, or it started out to be the laser building, a big aluminum building, which I find rather ugly. Not that the Quonsets were all that great, but that's a very interesting change. What none of us knew was that Kurt Vonnegut was as apprehensive as we were. He'd been trained in the sciences and had done graduate work in anthropology, and he'd never taken, never mind taught, a college course in fiction writing. I took a seat next to Andre Debus, a dear friend who played second dad to my son the previous spring when he'd been roughed up by a third-grade bully. And Andre, of course, became a very famous and splendid short story writer. He had news about our new guru. Vonnegut and his teenage daughter had moved into the big house on Van Buren Street, right next door to the Debus family. So Andre had already met him and assured me he was a great guy, lots of laughs. Just then, Mr. Vonnegut came through the door, ducking his head, to enter the sultry room, dressed in chinos, a somewhat rumpled short-sleeved shirt, and scruffy tan sneakers. He sat atop the desk at the front of the room and faced us. Conversations quieted abruptly. He was a great bear of a man, with an elongated, boyish face, cropped hair, and almost protruding hazel blue eyes. He surveyed the room of young writers, myself the exception in my mid-30s. I saw lots of smile lines around his eyes and a nice grin. He ground out a cigarette and pulled another from the Pall Mall pack in his shirt pocket. His hands were those of a pianist, with unusually long fingers. Lighting the cigarette, he told a joke and laughed profusely through the smoke, coughing just as much. A couple of students glanced at each other with rolled eyes. He would say later that following Berlin Castle in front of his audience was like following Judy Garland. His message that day was not profound, but it was clear. He hadn't been educated in an English department, but he knew the most important thing the writer had to remember was the reader. He drew some murmurs when he said he didn't see any reason for working on a story unless you wanted to sell it. Some of us still considered financial reward beneath our dignity. But his was another take on the craft. What do you need to be a writer in America? An audience. You don't need to supply useless information. Readers don't need to know how many freckles are on a lady's thigh and what she had for breakfast. And writers must provide enough props so readers are comfortable and don't get lost. It's okay to let them know right away where your character's going to end up, but then make your character clearly want something, so your readers will have to keep reading to find out how the character gets there. By the time he was finished, I was quietly impressed. Since I'd been supporting myself and 2 kids for several years as a journalist and public relations writer, I knew the value of keeping the reader reading to the end. And it didn't hurt that he had a sense of humor. I hoped that the first story I handed in a few weeks later met some of Mr. Vonnegut's expectations. I was nervous, but looking forward to our appointment. His tiny office in the Quonsets was furnished with a wooden desk, an old wooden desk and chair, plus a shabby upholstered recliner where he sat reading my manuscript, cigarette in hand. A typewriter rested atop an upside-down wastebasket next to him. For some reason, Kurt Vonnegut always typed like this, leaning over. He would type in his house on a windowsill, sit on a piano bench, leaning over this windowsill. I couldn't imagine. I mean, he's a very tall guy, but I knew his back must have just been terrible shape. Anyway, let's see, my He had a cheerful way of disarming apprehension and appearing to be intensely interested. Primed for his reactions, instead, I blurted out worries about my work and found myself revealing the disaster of the novel manuscript I'd abandoned the previous month. That past summer, when my 2 children had been away to visit their father, I devoted every available moment of that rare time to my own writing. With 40 pages of a novel completed that might qualify toward a required thesis for the Master of Fine Arts degree, I had rewarded myself to a night out at a newly released movie. To my dismay, the film's plot became increasingly recognizable. And soon after, my manuscript received a ritual cremation in my charcoal grill. I was writing the script to that movie, and I couldn't believe that that could have happened. It was something, I can't remember the name of the movie now. But. So now, I told Mr. Vonnegut, I had less than a year to finish a new novel or a book-length collection of stories in order to graduate by the end of next summer, and I had to graduate. Another year here was not financially possible. I stopped for breath. He would think I was an idiot. Without cracking a smile, he said, "You could have written Madame Bovary and tried to publish that if you really wanted to get in trouble." And somehow I was able to laugh instead of cry. That's how it began, the semester and a friendship that grew in richness and value over the next 40 years, until his death in the spring of 2007. Our relationship was mostly sustained by hundreds of letters and phone calls, with only occasional meetings. It granted me the opportunity to follow his career with unusual, if distant, intimacy, through his spectacular tenure as one of the most significant and beloved writers in America and abroad. Well, his career as a fiction writer did indeed continue to flourish after he left Iowa in 1968, with a lifetime total of 19 novels, as well as a number of other collections of essays and short stories. And he was widely sought as a public speaker throughout the world, including, incidentally, numerous appearances here in Iowa City, and he made 4 different trips to the University of Northern Iowa as well. I cannot tell you how many countries published his books, but I checked bookstores in every nation I ever visited, and I always found his, printed in the language of that country. I did not find my other workshop teachers' work in those bookstores. So that gives you, I thought, in a way, some indication of his popularity as a writer. He was 82 years old and living in Manhattan when he suffered an accident, perhaps with a result not unlike those that many of his characters sometimes suffered. He tripped on his porch steps and fell, receiving a devastating blow to the head from which he never regained consciousness. Among Kurt's many achievements was his ability to show that awareness is what makes life sacred. Not perfect, but sacred. To him, that meant life needed and deserved kindness, especially since he thought his most important insight was, I get this, life is no way to treat an animal. That really was. In fact, maybe a month before he died, he talked to me again about that, telling me that he believed that that was his most important insight. Life is no way to treat an animal. Because we are aware, and that gives us the paradox of making a lot of mistakes and thinking we know reality or cause when we don't. But that's why we need to be kind to ourselves, to each other, and ourselves. He was not a perfect human being, but one of his intentions as a writer and a person was then that kindness to others should be central to life, and including those who were themselves unkind. And I think that may be why he never could really create a villain in his own fiction. One of the curious and perhaps sacred things I observed about him was the self-generating joy his kindness made possible, a joy that seemed very much like love. Even so, accidents could always turn life on its ear. it always, and many of his characters, as you know if you've read him, they run into all kinds of accidents. It always made him feel better to laugh when that happened. Unfortunately, the last accident he experienced did not appear to give him time to laugh. But then he always tried to tell us that time was not what we thought it was anyway. And after all, the will of accident, which he took very seriously, may have been stronger at that time and in that day, than, and even perhaps even kind to him, if not to us. It helps me feel better to think he was okay with that. And he really did like naps. Rest in peace, Kurt. And thank